In this video, I'll be covering debugging and deploying my client application to Elastic Beanstalk, which I built in part 1. In part 1, I covered the client, server, and Docker configuration. In part 2 here, I'll cover the multi-Docker AWS Docker container architecture, and I'll deploy it to Elastic Beanstalk. So let's get started. Remember in part 1, if you haven't watched it yet, go to the link in the description and check out part 1 because I cover the client and server and building with Travis. Today I'll cover the next steps, taking this application and deploying it to Elastic Beanstalk. So let's get to deploying this application to Elastic Beanstalk. First off, let me take you to the GitHub project where you can fork and check out the source code for this project that I'm covering in this tutorial today. It is brandflake2267 debugging multi-Docker AWS EB, and EB is for Elastic Beanstalk. The first part, debugging the client and server source, it's located in another GitHub repo. But in this repo, it's the exact same source minus a few improvements to deploy to Elastic Beanstalk. So you can get everything in this repo and cover this in the very first video. Debugging the Express server and simple client using webpack, bundling for the client-side configuration. That video covers the breakpoints on the client and server and covers deploying using Travis CI. The second part, which is in this video, I'll be covering the debugging a client source with the Elastic Beanstalk. And one more note I want to highlight in this repo, if you scroll down towards the bottom past the debugging section, you'll get to a section called Configure Elastic Beanstalk Application Environment. Now in this video, I don't cover the creation and initialization of the Elastic Beanstalk environment. If you go through these instructions, it's pretty simple the way you can use ebinit to configure Elastic Beanstalk hosting configuration. So now that we've covered debugging in the first video and I've got my Elastic Beanstalk environment set up, let's get to debugging the application and deploying it to Elastic Beanstalk. All right, I'm in the root of my project. The very first thing I want to do is run npm run build. And what this does is build the project and output the resources into the dist directory. I cover this in greater detail in part 1, so I won't go into detail on all the specifics here. But what matters is the client and server resources are located in this directory. That means the Express web server is here and the HTML static resources. Okay, so I've built my project. What next? The next thing I want to do is define my Docker configuration. And how do I do that? I create a docker run.aws.json file. When Elastic Beanstalk initializes the EC2 instance, it uses the Docker run manifest to do that. So what happens in this Docker run manifest? It's like the Docker up or Docker file configuration. If you notice, all these instructions get translated into Elastic Beanstalk docker compose.yaml, although this is dynamically generated from this JSON configuration. By the way, this Elastic Beanstalk configuration file or directory is created when the ebinit command is run. And I won't cover this in great detail today. Back to Docker run. The very first thing I want to do is define my volumes. So I want to define the source directory, which is the root of this project. And I want to define the name of this volume, named web app. Okay, so then on to the container definitions. In this configuration, I only have one container. I could have multiple containers. And maybe I have a database container, maybe I have a web express container. The point is I have one container. Okay, so what am I going to name this container? I'm going to name it web app 2. I'm going to use the LTS node image, and this is a pre-built image available through Docker. I could build one and deploy it to ECS and use that image name, and I won't cover that in this episode today, but keep your eyes peeled. I'll have another episode out for that. I'm going to define the memory footprint that it uses to 256 megabytes. I could do more depending on the container I'm using, but I'm just going to set it to 256. I'm not doing any tuning here, and I won't cover that today in this video. I'm going to set the memory smaller than the size that I have for the EC2 container. All right, now what? I've got the command. What does the command do? Well, it executes the node process with the entry point. And that entry point is going to be based off of the mount. Okay, let's go to the mount then. So this is a little bit like Inception. So at first, this is a little hard to perceive what's going on here. So the mount takes the web app directory and says, I'm going to map that to the app directory within the Docker container. Now I'll cover this in a little bit more detail in a moment. So back to the command. I want to start the node process, but I want to map to the app directory where the source is now at. It's going to be the root of this project. I'm going to go to the dist directory because I'm going to run my application from the build output. I could run it from the root of the project, but the context and understanding and passing that off to another developer is a little bit more challenging than defining a build directory. And the same goes for client and server. So that's why I have distinctive directory names. Okay, so back to the command. app-dist-express.js. This executes the node process and starts up the Express web server. Now, if you remember in the first video, it starts the Express web server on port 3000. Okay, so now to the ports and how to map from the parent container to the Docker container port. So the parent container, I'm going to have a load balancer set up on port 80. When it gets to the parent container, it will proxy the request to the Docker container at port 3000. And I'll cover this in the debugging configuration in a little bit. For all things said, this file controls your EC2 configuration. Now that I have my configuration file set up, I need to know if I've configured it correctly. So how do I debug this environment? So I'm going to get to that. And what I want to do is use local run. After I have my Docker configuration set, I want to debug it. So how do I do that? I want to run local run. This will start up the environment that I have configured in the docker run.aws.json. Okay, great. I want to test this out and verify it works. If you notice, I have console output. Well, this is from the Docker container. So if I were to click on this, I wouldn't be able to get to it because it's inside the Docker container. And what does that mean? Well, let me start up another console and go docker ps. This will list the Docker instances that are running from the local run. Now, if you can see, I have a container ID, which image I'm using, the entry point, and the status of the container. But most importantly, you can see the reverse proxy here, which is 000, which is port 80 forwarding to 3000. Okay, so how would I test that? Well, I want to test that by going to a browser and going localhost 80. Okay, great, it works. So if I were to click on this, it should return the board is green. And that's perfect. Both the client and server-side processes are working in the local run Docker configuration, which is in the Docker container. So that's great. If I were to have problems, what then? Okay, so let's just investigate what would happen if I have a problem in my Docker configuration. Now there's two ways to look at this. One, the Docker container won't start, so you'll have to look at why that is, and you can check out what's in the logs here. You can look at the configuration output to see why it's failing, and that would be in the first console output. And let's say it's in the Docker configuration, because often that's what happens to me. What does that mean? Well, if I've set up my source correctly, now there's some tricks here that can happen, and I may not get to all of them today. So keep your eyes peeled. I'll have more coming. But most of all, you want to map and mount to the source directory, and you want to execute the process with the libraries that you need for Express in the Docker container. So let me just cover getting into that Docker container. So I'm going to go back to the second console, and I did docker ps to list the containers. And what I want to do is actually bash into this container. And how would I do that? I'll go docker x. And by the way, when you're on the AC2 instance, you'll have to add sudo, and I'll cover that in a minute. Okay, so docker x -it, and I want to add the Docker container ID or the name, but I like to copy the ID. So then after that, I'm going to go bin bash. On a Mac, you could just type bash, but on the EC2, you have to directly state bin bash. I'll hit enter. I bashed into the Docker container. So if I go ls, I can see the directory contents. What I want to look at is the app directory. So if I go ls app, this is the app directory that is mounted in the container. If you look, I have app here, which is the web app, and then which mounts to var app current. Now, I don't have the exact parent or host container format or architecture like EC2, and I'll cover that in a minute. But I do have the app directory. So let's just look at the app directory, cd app, and then I'll just ls. I can see the docker run.aws configuration, the client, dist, and package and server. So if I were to go to dist, which is the directory I want, the other directories won't show up on EC2, and I'll show you why in a moment. But most importantly, I use the dist directory or express server in the dist directory. So if I see the dist, go ls, I can see I have express.js and the node modules or the libraries that Express uses to initialize. Back to the EB local run process, and I'm going to go Control C to stop the process. So now that I'm ready to deploy, what do I need to do to get it to Elastic Beanstalk? So how do I do that? So I'm going to cover how I use the build server to push the bits up to Elastic Beanstalk. So I'm going to go to travis.yaml. I use Travis as a build service to push out the bits to Elastic Beanstalk. And this YAML configuration file gives the instructions to Travis, the build process, on how to build and deploy my application. So let me just cover it, and I won't go into great detail, but I think you'll recognize these commands if you're familiar with the Node Package Manager process. First off, I state the language that I'm using for my build process, and that's Node.js, and I'm going to use LTS. I'm going to install the application, which downloads the third-party libraries and so forth. Then I'll run a script called npm run build, just like I did locally a moment ago when I was showing you this process. After that, just before the deploy process, I want to clean up a few things because I don't need to send everything to EC2 to run the application. What does that mean? Well, the client and server now are orphans because I've now built everything and put it in the dist directory, so I don't need the client source or the server source. And for a little bit of nitty gritty, I don't even need the package.json or package lock files in the root of this project. So this cleans it up. And the reason why I want to clean it up is when I need to debug the process on EC2, it's a little easier to find what I'm after. Okay, so now to what's important. The deploy process. Travis has a service called deploy for Elastic Beanstalk. Now these are the configuration parameters that I set to deploy to Elastic Beanstalk. And what's important here is my access key ID and my secret key. And if you notice, I have secure and a long hash for both the ID and the key. The way I created these secure IDs, if you scroll down, I used Travis, the CLI tool, to go Travis encrypt my key and Travis encrypt my secret key. They output the hashes and I pasted them above and away I go. Something to note, the region is important here. It's important to note that your app, environment, and bucket should be in the same region as you specify here in the deploy configuration context. So what happens is when I push my changes up to GitHub and merge them into the master branch, Travis pulls the repo, and when it sees a change, builds it and runs these instructions and deploys to Elastic Beanstalk. Okay, so let's look at how that process occurs. I'll run that process right now and we'll just go through it. So let's just create a quick change and the README, commit it, and see how it builds. So I'm just going to hit enter, save it, and I'm going to go over to the VCS controls and I'll commit these changes. For example, I'll just say do a quick build commit, and I'm going to push up with git lens, push, one commit, and then I'm going to go to the project, and I've already got the project loaded, and in a minute here we'll see this build. Okay, so the build has started because I pushed directly to master, and if I scroll down, I see the build process has started and is now executing the instructions in the travis.yaml configuration. And I can take a look at that view config file. Okay, so once it's done building, it's going to push to the S3 bucket, and let's just look at that S3 bucket. It pushes to the Donaldson deploy bucket, and you can see the app showed up here. Nice thing to notice is that you can download this and make sure it replicates to the directory. But before that, let me just highlight the Elastic Beanstalk build process. So I'm going to click on the environment configuration. It is now building and deploying to the EC2 instances. So if I look at EC2, I can see the configuration. And since I have a mutable configuration set up, it replaces the previous instance with a new instance. And I wanted to show that immutable does that. And the reason why I use immutable right at the beginning of a project is because my architecture has been changing quite often as I'm testing the environment. And this allows me to just verify that the environment is clean and working accordingly before I move to a non-immutable instance. Now, there's lots of ways to configure EC2 and AWS and all that jazz, but I won't be covering that in great detail today. Okay, back to the S3 bucket. Now, let me just show you a quick debugging tip. I'm going to download this and inspect it. Okay, I'm going to open up the file folder. What I want to do is inspect the zip to see if it has the contents in this construction that I set in the Travis CI configuration YAML file. And a note, what I'm after is the dist directory. This is the most important directory in the configuration format that I have. And that is because Express is in here. I have the node modules, which Express needs, and the static files. So I can inspect the exact same configuration I should expect in the EC2 container on the other side. Okay, so let's look at the EC2 container. So I'm going to go back to the AWS environment. And what I want to do is just look at the container it's deploying to. Well, I can see that it's still pushing out. And what I want to do is just refresh this to see if it's finished yet. Well, it hasn't finished yet, so it's still initializing. But I could go to the EC2 list and just refresh this as well and see which one it's instantiating or listing. Okay, so I'll just pick one of these because it'll terminate the old one and move to the new one. Well, I already know that I had this selected, so let's just select. So how do I log on to this environment? Well, I'm going to right click and go connect. So I'm going to copy this. This is one of my favorite ways to log on. There's more than one way. You can select Session Manager and EC2 Connect, but I'm just going to go ahead and use the old-fashioned format of using SSH to connect to my environment. Now this might be different depending on your configuration and the way you're using your environment. But in this one, it's easy squeezy for this tutorial. Let's get to logging in to the EC2 container. So I'm going to go close, and I want to go back to my terminal, and I'll use the terminal in my VS Code environment. So what I want to do is open up a new console, and I'm going to go into my keys directory. And what I want to do is paste in that command I copied. And the reason why I'm in my keys directory is I have my private key to log on to the server there. So then I'm going to hit enter, and I'll say yes because I want to accept that fingerprint, and I'm on. So the very first thing I do when I get into the Docker container is I want to go sudo docker ps to list the containers. And I'm verifying my container is running. And I know the container that I want to run is going to look just like the one that ran in the EB local run. In this case, AWS also runs an agent container in this format. So let's go to the root of the working directory. So let's go cd var app and current. Remember when I showed the Docker configuration and the Docker file as var app current. So my source should be there. So I'm going to go cd into it and ls. And fantastic. So it's the exact same contents that I saw in the zip format. Now I see dist, the Docker run, node modules, so forth. I could actually remove these node modules in my deploy configuration. And I'll do that in some later time. What I'm after is the dist directory. So I'll go ls dist. I can see the Express is there, the node modules that I need to run Express. So it's golden. Okay, so I know the contents are here, but are they in the Docker container? So let's look at that. Now, if I misconfigured my mounts, they wouldn't be there. So let's just confirm. So how do I get into the Docker container? Well, I'm going to go Docker PS to list the container IDs. You'll notice I put Docker PS. Well, I can't do that. So I have to go sudo Docker PS to list the container IDs. I'm going to copy the container I want to log into and go sudo docker x it docker ID and then bin bash to bash into the container. Now that I'm in the container, remember that in EB local run, I had the app directory in the root. Well, let's just see if I have the same thing. So I'll go cd root and then go ls. And there it is, the app directory. So if I go to the cd app directory, I should have the same exact contents as the mount. And there's the dist. So if I go cd dist ls, and there's my contents that matter. Now that I know the command that I set in the Docker configuration, just down here, node app dist express.js, you can see it will execute properly because it'll go express, and then the express uses the node modules. So that was pretty easy. So it's easy to debug the EC2 instance, both the host container and the Docker containers within the EC2 instance. Okay, so there's a couple more things I want to note while in the Docker container. One is the logs, and I want to go into the log directory, cd var log, and I'll go ls. Okay, so if you notice, I don't have any logs in this container that are for this configuration context. But in some configurations, there'll be some nice logs here to look at. So I'm going to go back to the host container. I'm going to exit the Docker container, and I'm going to go cd var log and ls. Okay, so there's more files to look at in the logs, in the host container logs. And the one that I am most interested in most of the time is the EB activity log. When I'm setting up my project, if I make a mistake, it's going to show up in the EB activity log. So if I look at that log, tail EB activity log, I can see there's some output. Well, this is one way to look at it. If you want to look at it in real time, you could go tail-f EB activity. Now that isn't very helpful in most instances in this case, because by the time you log on, you just want to cat the log file or tail it, or there's another way to look at it. And how's that? So I'm going to go back to the EC2 instance. Well, I can't look at the logs here easily, but I can from the Elastic Beanstalk dash. Okay, so it's still spinning, so I'll hit refresh. Okay, refresh updated. So I'm going to go over to the logs link, click on the logs, and I'll request the last 100 lines of the log files on the app servers. In this case, there's only one instance running. In some cases, you may have 5, 10, 15, 20, and maybe more depending on the size of your org and application. Okay, so I'm going to click on download. It quickly loads the file, so I'll go and look for EB activity.log. So if you quickly scan down, there it is. There's the contents. Well, when things go wrong, you'll see error or failure, and you can look and quickly scan this file for errors and failures. And that will allow you to quickly debug and narrow down what's going wrong with your deployment and allow you to quickly fix and redeploy your application. Let me go back to the console. There's another note I want to cover, and that is you can curl the local host here in the host container. So if I curl localhost, because I'm in the container, so it should be running on port 80. So if I curl localhost, okay, great. So I could see the web page is loading. That's great. If you have a miswired load balancer, you can curl here just to verify the app is running before you assume that's EC2 container configuration that's miswired. So if I go sudo docker ps, you'll note that when you're in the Docker container, it will be on port 3000. So you want to go, so when you bash into the container, you can go curl localhost at port 3000 and you'll get the same web page. So that's an easy way to verify that your EC2 container is running as you configured it. Okay, the last thing I want to do is go back to the dash and verify my application is running in Elastic 2 Beanstalk environment. So how would I do that? So I'm going to go back to the Elastic Beanstalk configuration, and there's a URL or endpoint that I can click on to verify it's running. And there it is. It's loaded up my static HTML resources from the Express web server and the Docker container in my environment. So I'm going to click on try local API request, and this will do an API request back to the Express web server and returns the JSON object. So that's great. I can see my web application is now running on the Elastic Beanstalk service. So that's it. This brings me to the conclusion of this video. So thanks for watching my video today, and follow me for more tips and tricks, and I'll catch you later.